During the last 5 days of August, the Tokyo Express was busier than usual. Except for sporadic successes, the Marine pilots were not able to prevent Admiral Tanaka from landing a large number of troops and supplies at Taivu Point to the east of the Marine enclave and at Cape Esperance at the extreme northwest tip of the island. On the 28th, however, the Tokyo Express started its run too early in the day and arrived within range of the Henderson-based bombers before sunset. The dive-bombing offensive that ensued cost the Japanese 1 destroyer sunk, 2 others damaged. This made it more obvious than ever, Tanaka wrote, what sheer recklessness it was to attempt a landing operation against strong resistance without preliminary neutralization of enemy air power. To this end, 24 Zeros were forwarded to Rabaul from the Marshall Islands on August 27th. That same day, the Buka airstrip on the northern shore of Bougainville Island became operational, and on the 28th, 29 Zeros moved to it. Tactical development on both sides often proved to be remarkably in phase. Only 2 days later, the Cactus Air Force welcomed aboard, in the middle of a Japanese raid, the remaining 2 squadrons of Colonel William J. Wallace's Marine Air Group 23. These were Major Robert E. Gaylor's VMF 224 and Major Leo R. Smith's VMSB 231. Gaylor, one of the top aces of the war, had his pilots up in the air tangling with enemy within 24 hours. The newly landed Japanese troops were known as the Kawaguchi Brigade, after the commanding officer, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. General Kawaguchi was a strong-willed and narrow-minded individual who, like his unsuccessful predecessor, Colonel Ichiki, had a highly developed sense of ritual. So much so, in fact, that he took along with him, when he landed at Taivu on the night of August 31st, the dress-white uniform in which he meant to accept the sword of the American commanding general at surrender ceremonies. Kawaguchi thought these ceremonies would take place shortly after his decisive offensive on the airfield, which he had scheduled for September 13th. For the purpose, Kawaguchi had one of his own regiments, the 124th Infantry, supplemented by the previously uncommitted battalions of Colonel Ichiki's 4th Infantry, and an assortment of mortar and pack howitzer batteries and service detachments, a force of about 6,000 men. Kawaguchi's plan called for a surprise attack, the main force of which was to strike south of the airfield. Supporting thrusts would come from the east across the Tenaru to roll back the enemy's left flank, and from the west across the Matanikau to push the enemy's right flank back from the Lunga River, and from that vantage point to strike the airport from the northwest. This 3-pronged offensive required for its success, in addition to the element of surprise, a considerable amount of precision and coordination. There was little accumulated evidence to show that this was easily achieved in the rank-overgrown jungles of Guadalcanal, but Kawaguchi was nevertheless confident. The first unfortunate event among several that were to throw the general's carefully made plans into disarray occurred on the night of September 4th, when the last 1,000 men of the brigade in small barges encountered rough seas and, early the following morning, an even rougher shelling. At a cost of almost 400 men, this force, under Colonel Akinosuke Oka, did finally make it to Cape Esperance. Somewhat the worse for his initial encounter with the enemy, but undaunted, Colonel Oka marched his men east to the Matanikau River. The main Kawaguchi force, at about the same time, was marching west through the jungles, hoping to come undetected upon the marine lines from the south. However, they had been detected. Scouts from Coast Watcher Martin Clemens's constabulary reported increased enemy activity near Tasimboko village, not far from Taivu Point, in early September. Edson's raiders boarded ship for Taivu Point to investigate the reports, and made contact with Kawaguchi's rear echelon, who were mostly communications and supply personnel. The Kawaguchi base camp at Tasimboko, and all its supplies including the general's dress whites, fell without much resistance to the raiders. Much of the equipment and stores was destroyed, including 500 rounds of bullets and artillery shells, but much of it, items such as tins of crab meat and sliced beef, cases of Japanese beer and flasks of sake, went back to Kukum with the raiders. Kawaguchi's dress whites went up on the mast as a victory trophy. A number of captured documents, maps and photos verified the reports of enemy troops in strength. "This is no motley of Japanese," said Colonel Edson. Colonel Jerry Thomas, Vandergrift's intelligence officer, agreed. "They're coming," he said. Together, the two officers reached the conclusion that Kawaguchi meant to invade somewhere south of the airfield. And it was Edson's opinion that the main thrust would come along a gnarled outcropping of coral, lightly covered with kunai grass, that sloped down into the jungle to the south, east, and west. Vandergrift had only recently displaced his command post to less than 100 yards north of this ridge, as a means of getting away from the incessant shelling of the airfield. Even when he learned he had inadvertently chosen a hot spot for his resting place, Vandergrift went ahead with the move. "This was no act of courage," he reported. "I simply wanted a good night's sleep." He was not to get it until much later. Kawaguchi had lost the element of surprise. As his men wearily trudged and stumbled forward through the hostile jungle, Edson moved quickly to reinforce the 1,000-yard-long spur that was to be known, variously, as Edson's Ridge, or Vicious Ridge, or simply the Ridge. After the battle, it would need no further identification. On the morning of the 10th, Edson, with a sense of humour not everybody could appreciate, informed his men they were displacing. "Too much heavy fires and shelling here close to the beach," he grinned. "We're moving to a quiet spot." The raiders finished their breakfast of damp rice and dehydrated potatoes and marched to the ridge. There they deployed, facing to the south and to the west, covering the terrain toward the Lunga River. The 1st Parachute Battalion, under Captain Harry Torgerson, secured the east flank, tying in with the 3D Battalion of the 1st Marines, in line along the Tenaru. The digging in went on throughout the day, but not without interruptions from enemy raids. Apparently, Japanese spotters on nearby Mount Austin, the dominant terrain feature, had noted and pinpointed the raider activity, for the Bettys dropped 500-pounders and daisy cutters not on the airfield, but directly on the ridge. All the signs indicated a major engagement was building. Accordingly, Vandergrift had almost his entire force spread thinly on the drawn-out perimeter, which went from 1,500 yards inland along the Tenaru, up to the coast, west past Kukum, and then 1,500 yards back south along the Lunga. Off by themselves to the south were the raiders along the ridge. For a division reserve, Vandergrift had held back the 2D Battalion, 5th Marines. All other units were online. Much to his irritation, Kawaguchi's carefully prepared schedule had been altered. Imperial General Headquarters learned that a convoy of American transports had landed in the Fijis on September 5th. They could only be headed for Guadalcanal. Kawaguchi was instructed to move his invasion up to the night of September 12th. This was disconcerting. It meant a new coordination. Colonel Oka had to be notified. The gunfire support schedule had to be rescheduled. Very well. Kawaguchi would do his best. The American reinforcements, the 7th Marines, weren't necessarily going to Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley, who controlled them, hadn't yet decided what to do with them. Admiral Turner urged him to give Vandergrift the regiment as the reinforcement he had long requested, but Gormley was not yet ready to make up his mind. However, he did release a squadron of 24 available Navy Wildcats from the damaged Saratoga to Vandergrift. Admiral Turner visited the general on the 11th and brought him very bad news indeed. Intelligence reports made it evident that the Japanese were building up to a climactic encounter. Rabaul and Truk were receiving massive naval forces. The air bases at Vunakunau and Lakunai were being heavily reinforced. Rabaul Simpson Harbour was clogged with dozens of warships and transports. There would certainly be a major amphibious effort soon, within weeks perhaps, and Gormley was short of ships and planes and every other sort of supply needed to counter. Things looked grim. But Turner was not as pessimistic about the situation as his boss was. "He does not believe I can get the 7th Marine Regiment in here," the Admiral said, "but I think I have a scheme that will fool the Japanese." The situation was clearly critical. Vandergrift saw Turner off and then turned to Colonel Thomas. "Jerry," he said, "we are going to defend this airfield until we no longer can. If that happens, we will take what is left to the hills and fight guerrilla warfare. I want you to go see Bill Twining, swear him to secrecy, and have him draw up a plan." Thomas did so, and Lieutenant Colonel Twining sought out the privacy he needed to draw up this contingency operation order. When he had finished it, it went into his safe. It was never used. The encounter to which the Japanese were building came much sooner than Admiral Turner's intelligence anticipated. Admiral Yamamoto, in his mammoth flagship, the 69,000-ton battleship Yamato, led the 50-odd ships of the combined fleet into Truk Harbour on September 5th. For 3 days, a round of tactical conferences took place aboard the flagships of the different fleet units, and then finally Yamamoto himself held the concluding conference aboard Yamato. Yamamoto was his taciturn self at the final conference, reported Captain Tamechi Hara, skipper of destroyer Amatsukaze. He cautioned against underestimating American fighting strength, and the session ended with the issuance of 2 simple instructions. Number 1. Keep the location and movements of our carriers unknown to the enemy. Number 2. Make initial airstrikes against the enemy as strong as possible. The following morning, combined fleet steamed out of Truk, looking forward to a climactic showdown with the American fleet. At the same time, there was going to be an all-out attack against Guadalcanal in support of the Kawaguchi Brigade. In this fleet, newly assigned to command of Destroyer Squadron 2, was Admiral Tanaka, late of the Tokyo Express, rested from his days of trial. Everyone in this large fleet was optimistic as the ships sped on their way, Tanaka recalled. It began to rain at sunset on the 12th. Under cover of the rain and darkness, the Japanese troops crept forward in anticipation of the push-off. But the very conditions that cloaked their advance also proved a hindrance. General Kawaguchi soon lost control of the brigade. The jungle swallowed them, some here, some there, scattering them into small groups that were not tactically self-sufficient. It was no way to fight a war, but Kawaguchi had his orders. Despite his feelings of helplessness, he signalled the invasion. The Tokyo Express supplied an offshore shelling directed at the ridge, and rifle and machine gun fire erupted. The Marines could hear the distinctive clatter of the Japanese 25 caliber Nambu machine guns. It was at best a sputtering invasion, and it never got going, except for some men on the right who displaced the Marine defenders, but only temporarily, falling back before a dawn counter-attack that recaptured all the penetrated land. On the defenders' left flank some holes had been punched, but again First Light found the Marines in control of the entire front. "In my whole life I have never felt so helpless," Kawaguchi confessed. "When I looked about I saw only Senior Adjutant Yamamoto, my faithful orderly Noguchi, and 4 or 5 others. It was a tragedy. If we had not received our orders from headquarters and had carried out our attack on the night of the 13th, such a miserable failure might have been avoided." If Kawaguchi was frustrated, so was Admiral Yamamoto. Combined fleet spent all night waiting to hear that the airfield had been captured. It fretted the entire next day. Finally, late that night, Naval Air Headquarters at Rabaul flashed the word. According to our reconnaissance, the enemy airfields at Guadalcanal seemed to be held by our forces. Yamamoto did not entirely trust this message. He decided to wait until the following morning and send out his own scout planes. On the morning of the 13th, Colonel Edson and his company commanders munched on GI rations and discussed the situation. "The Japanese will be back," Edson said. "I want to surprise him." The positions were improved. The Marines dug still further into the coral and, most important, tightened their lines. The contraction resulted in better fields of fire for the machine guns. It also forced the invaders to cross about 100 yards of open terrain between the jungle and the outposts, a very long distance to cover under the massed fire of a Marine battalion. That same morning, the fire support situation was confused. Commander, 11th Air Fleet, was not sure the airfield was in Japanese hands. It was thought that perhaps the invasion had been postponed. Still, one could not take the chance of shelling one's own men. The decision was made that it was not safe to use heavy arms against either the airfield or the ridge. Kawaguchi did get fire support from the Tokyo Express, however, starting at 9 o'clock in the evening, just as he released his first wave of troops. 7 destroyers pounded Henderson Field. 2 reinforced battalions, about 2,000 men, hurled themselves at Edson's raiders on Vicious Ridge. The raiders were not without artillery support of their own. On the morning of the 10th, Colonel Jaime del Valle had displaced his division artillery so it could provide close support for Edson. The howitzers were pre-registered on selected checkpoints, so that as Kawaguchi's men streamed across the open ground, the artillery forward observers up front with Edson's line companies had only to call back to their fire direction centre and demand fire on the checkpoints. They did, and the rounds came in on target, blowing huge gaps in the charging Japanese formations. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and small arms fire. There was also a war of hurled epithets. The night was vivid with flares, shell fire, obscenity, raucous challenges, and the screams of the men sacrificing their lives for their homelands. The first invasion lasted about 2 hours, and despite the horrible carnage, the Japanese pressure was so intense that the marine lines turned in at the edges, like a steel bar bent in the hands of a strong man. Vandergrift had begun feeding in the reserves, and that had helped some. Finally, at about 11 p.m., it appeared that the Japanese had been turned back. At Vandergrift's command post there was cautious optimism. "Looks like we have won the first round," Colonel Thomas said. Just then, Major Ken Bailey came into the command post and told the general his Marines had run out of grenades. Staff officers collected grenades for Bailey, who then ran back to the front and crawled from foxhole to foxhole on his hands and knees to distribute them. Correspondent Tregaskis, who had been sleeping on a ridge close to the airfield, was so accustomed to the sounds of firing that the small arms had not kept him from dozing. But Del Valle's artillery woke him up. The shells were whirring just over our position in the ridge top, skimming over the trees, then hitting and exploding a few hundred yards to the south, apparently in the area where the fighting was going on. Tregaskis slept no more that night. Shortly after midnight, Kawaguchi launched the second invasion, and from where Tregaskis was, sounds of firing could be heard not only to the south, where Edson was defending, but also to the east, from the direction of the Tenaru. He could hear Louis the Louse circling above, dropping flares in all directions. At the command post, Vandergrift learned that a heavy invasion had been launched against the left flank, where Colonel William McKelvey's battalion was holding at the Tenaru. This invasion was being contained, which was just as well, since the entire division reserve was being force-fed unit by unit in support of Edson's hard-pressed raiders. The din of battle was so great that Vandergrift could hardly hear what was being said on the phones. A moment later, a mortar barrage rained on the command post and snipped phone contact with the raiders. The booming and shrieking sounds of combat went on, but Vandergrift was isolated. He could only wait patiently while the communications people worked on the commo lines. Edson was holding, but only barely. His left had begun to fold, and he had ordered the parachutists back to prepared positions. One more strong push by Kawaguchi might do it. The scuttlebutt around the command post was that Japanese parachutists were landing, but this rumour proved to be false. "Well," Vandergrift said cheerfully, "it's only a few more hours till dawn. Then we'll see where we stand." With the phones working again, Edson was able to report that he was running low on ammunition. Some belted machine gun bullets and grenades went forward. At about 3 a.m. Edson called again. The ammunition had not arrived. "I'm almost out," Edson said. A few minutes later, Edson called again, and he sounded much cheerier. The ammunition had arrived just in time. Edson had been standing behind his men to keep them from breaking, and when a few tried to fall back, Edson shouted, "Go back where you came from. The only thing they have that you do not is guts." The men returned to their posts and held. At dawn, the P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron came roaring over the Japanese lines down close to the deck, ripping into the jungle with 37mm shells. Kawaguchi's attack had stalled anyway. He didn't have enough strength to maintain pressure. He no longer had close support firepower, and the Marines did. It was all over. Kawaguchi ordered a retirement. There would still be sporadic shooting that afternoon. Colonel Oka would mount a very tardy invasion along the Matanikau, and snipers and fanatics were everywhere, including a couple who broke into Vandergrift's command post, but for all practical purposes, with the appearance of the Army P-400S, the Battle of Vicious Ridge ended. Kawaguchi's brigade was ruined. Casualties ran almost to 20%. There were 708 deceased, another 505 wounded. Of these, many more would die during the long, arduous retreat through the jungle to the west. Not until 8 more days had passed would the forward echelons of the battalions that had invaded the vicious ridge crawl and totter into the safety of Colonel Oka's perimeter west of the Matanikau River. They had discarded all their heavy weapons, all their spare ammunition, even their helmets and backpacks. They survived on tree bark and plant roots and muddy water. They were bedraggled and beaten men, but at least they had survived. It could have been worse, and it would have been much worse if Edson's raiders had been in any shape to pursue. But the Americans had been badly hurt also. Of 377 officers and men who had landed on Gavutu when the Guadalcanal campaign started, the East Parachute Battalion had suffered the loss of 212 lives and wounded. The raiders were not much better off. Their casualty rate was higher than 30%. There was no question of pursuing Kawaguchi's retreating column. Vandergrift wrote a letter to his division, expressing his pride in their efforts and noting the fierceness of the engagement, which had been drawn not only with heavy weapons but with bayonets, pistols and knives in single combat. He singled out the raiders, the parachutists and Del Valle's artillerymen for special praise, and among these put in the battlemaster, Red Mike Edson and Major Bailey for medals of honor. In the enemy camp there were no medals, and there was little cause for optimism. Not only had Kawaguchi's invasion failed, but Yamamoto had been unable to lure the American fleet into the decisive naval action he sought. Combined fleet scouted southward as far as Endeni on the 13th, then northward to approximately 350 miles northeast of Tulagi on the 14th, without making contact. On the 15th, word was received that submarine I-19 had attacked and severely damaged United States aircraft carrier Wasp, southeast of Guadalcanal. Later in the day, Wasp had to be sunk by American torpedoes. It was the one bright moment in an otherwise dismal episode of war for the Japanese military. Combined Fleet returned to Truk after almost 2 weeks of what Admiral Tanaka described as nothing more than a fuel-consuming operation. But something had come of the debacle. The Japanese High Command finally came to realize that nothing less than a full-scale operation could hope to dislodge the stubborn American Marines. Henceforth, troops would not be committed to the Guadalcanal operation in less than division strength. At the time she was torpedoed, Wasp was serving as troop transport escort, along with sister ship Hornet, battleship North Carolina, and several destroyers. Admiral Turner had promised General Vandergrift that he would fool the enemy and get the 7th Marines to the island, which he did, but his plan did not prevent Japanese submarines from worming past the destroyer screen early in the afternoon of September 15th. In the middle of a routine turn, Wasp took 2 torpedoes from the I-19 and shortly assumed an extreme starboard list. Internal explosions soon called for abandonment, at a cost of 193 of the ship's crew of more than 2,200. 5 miles to the northeast, the I-15 attacked Hornet, but the alarm had been sounded via the TBS by destroyer Lansdowne, and the carrier was able to evade the torpedoes, one of which, however, hit North Carolina, punching a large hole on the port side beneath the waterline. The majestic battleship shook off this blow and doggedly made port on her own power. Less fortunate was destroyer O'Brien, which also took a torpedo and sank on the way back to the west coast. The primary target of this torpedo attack escaped unscathed. This was the Marine Regiment that had been loaded aboard 6 transports which, early on the morning of September 18th, sailed into Iron Bottom Sound. Correspondent Richard Tregaskis went down to the beach to watch the ships unload. The new Marines, he noted, wore clean uniforms and helmets and talked like tough guys. However much they had to learn, they were welcome. To the embattled Marines, it was proof that they hadn't been abandoned to a dismal fate by the politics of a 2-ocean war. There were more than 4,000 men in Colonel James Webb's regiment, which had been part of the Ist Division until the spring of 1942, when they were detached and sent to garrison Samoa. The regiment could claim more than its share of colourful officers. Among them were Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hanneken, a veteran of the banana wars of Haiti and Nicaragua, and the combative Chesty Puller. Because of his short 5'6" frame and prominent chest musculature, Major Louis Puller was called Chesty, a nickname that also suited his cocky bantam rooster temperament. While on Samoa, he had complained, "Here I am, stuck out here to rot on this damned island while other people fight the war. They have marooned us." Along with the men, the regiment also brought in tanks, engineers, a battalion of artillery, rations, ammunition, and even such post-exchange trivia as shoe polish and snuff. The new regiment enabled Vandergrift to put fresh strength into his perimeter, and it also permitted him to send the IST Parachute Battalion, down to half strength at best, back to Espiritu Santo on Turner's transports. Despite their name, the parachutists were destined not to jump during the war. Before sundown and the anticipated arrival of the Tokyo Express, the American Navy had unloaded, boarded its passengers, and made haste to depart the troubled waters. Vandergrift, with a strength of 19,000 men now at his disposal, made plans to expand his perimeter by pushing west against the Matanikau. By September 24th, he was ready to commence the operation. On that morning, he sent Chesty Puller's battalion out, heading for Mount Austin. The terrain feature the Marines called Grassy Knoll. All in all, Vandergrift was feeling good about his ability to hold the perimeter. He wrote Turner, "After our two experiences of the Tenaru and the attack on the rear Vicious Ridge, I feel confident that if we can have 50 to 100 yards of clear space in front of us, well wired, mined and booby-trapped, that our fire and grenades will stop any attack they can make, certainly long enough to throw in our reserves for a counter-attack." He was fairly certain the Japanese would mount subsequent attacks from the west and south, and it was in that direction that he kicked off his own campaign. The battle, known as Second Matanikau, lasted 3 days and was far from being successful. Puller's battalion was unable to climb Mount Austin owing to an enemy force entrenched there. Puller turned west to the Matanikau instead, but again met the enemy in force and was unable to cross the river. He led his men north to the river mouth along a jungle trail which was interdicted the entire way by mortar fire from the west bank. It was obvious that the enemy was there in strength. Vandergrift, in the meantime, had sent Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Griffith's raiders south to cross the river and come in behind the enemy. At the same time, the 2D Battalion of the 5th Marines massed at the river mouth to blast an opening at the sandbar. Puller's battalion was added to this second phase of the battle, boarding boats for an amphibious landing to the west of Point Cruz. The plan fizzled when the raiders proved no more able to dent the Matanikau defences than Puller had been. In this action, Ken Bailey, the Medal of Honor winner at Gory Ridge, sacrificed his life, and Griffith himself badly wounded. Red Mike Edson, in overall command of the operation, was to suffer the same frustrations that had plagued Kawaguchi in his invasion. Like Kawaguchi, Edson had a 3-pronged attack going, but communication was poor, coordination difficult, the terrain poorly reconnoitred, and the strength of the enemy force unknown. In fact, there were more than 4,000 Japanese defending the Matanikau, online and in reserve, and the jungle on this occasion was their ally. Puller's landing at Point Cruz proved a disaster and had to be recalled. Altogether, 2nd Matanikau cost 67 deceased and 125 wounded, and it caused Vandergrift to call off the operation. "It taught me a big lesson," he later wrote, "the danger of overconfidence." Nevertheless, Vandergrift had no choice but to mount another thrust in strength in that direction, when he learned, late in September, that the Japanese build-up in the Matanikau Point Cruz area had been supplied with long-range 155mm howitzers which would put Henderson Field well within range of their shells. It became vital to deny the Japanese the west bank of the river, and for that purpose Vandergrift assigned half of the 10 available battalions. Once again, Colonel Edson was put in command of the operation, which went under the name of 3rd Matanikau. The date for the push forward was set at October 7th. That same day, Japanese troops mounted an operation of their own for the purpose of establishing forward lines on the east bank of the Matanikau. Once again, American and Japanese intentions proved to be tuned to identical tactical elaborations. The Japanese troops were the forward elements of the famous Sendai 2D Division, recently arrived at Rabaul from duty in Java. This division was to spearhead the large-scale attack scheduled for October 17th, commanded by no less a personage than 17th Army Commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutate, whose headquarters was displacing to Guadalcanal the night of October 9th. The 2D Division Commander, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, and a portion of his division moved up to Tassafaronga on October 3rd. The action beginning October 7th grew out of Maruyama's intention to prepare for Hyakutate's big push by securing a protected river crossing for tanks. He also had in mind a secure forward position as protection for the large 6-inch howitzers he had been promised by Rabaul. Firefights first erupted on the morning of October 7th when point elements of the 5th Marines ran into machine gun fire along the coastal government track, which ran west from Kukum to the Matanikau. 2 battalions of this regiment pushed the defenders back almost to the river line, where they stubbornly held. They would not be pushed back any farther. Edson brought up a raider company in anticipation of the following morning's decisive drive across the sandspit, but when the following morning arrived, some torrential rains came with it, and the entire operation was washed out for the day. In the evening, the Japanese mounted an attack of their own that cost them 60 dead. The raider company, badly hurt in this operation, 34 casualties among fewer than 100 men, was sent back to the perimeter, not to fight again on Guadalcanal. Other elements of Edson's 5-battalion force had not yet made contact. Their deployment proceeded as planned. A reinforced battalion commanded by Colonel William Whaling bivouacked on October 7th about 2,000 yards inland from the river mouth. Supporting this unit were 2 battalions of the 7th Marines, Pullers and Hannekens. Whaling crossed the river on the morning of the 9th, wheeled right along a ridge, and headed north for the sea. Behind him, Hanneken continued west about 200 yards farther along, then executed the same manoeuvre. Puller went still farther west, then followed suit, so that the 3 battalions were all driving north to Iron Bottom Sound along an extended front. Whaling and Hanneken met no resistance, but advance patrols of Puller's battalion ran into an enemy bivouac area in the jungle. Puller put his men on a ridgeline and called for artillery fire. The 105-man Mer. Shells burst in the bivouac area with devastating effect and caused the Japanese soldiers to break for the ridge and presumed safety, only to run into Puller's machine guns and mortars. In History of Marine Corps Operations in World War II, Puller's deployment is dryly described as a most effective arrangement for methodical extermination. More than 700 men of the 3D Battalion of Colonel Nomasu Nakaguma's 4th Infantry lay dead in the dark green jungle. These men were part of General Maruyama's 2D Division, and even though the 3 American battalions disengaged and returned to the perimeter east of the Matanikau, Maruyama's main lines had been pushed back 2 miles from the river. This was the news that greeted General Hyakutate when he arrived from the Shortlands that night and established his command post in the valley of a nameless river about 3 kilometers west of Kokumbona. This meant, among other things, that the American airstrip was now out of effective artillery range. It was clear to Hyakutate that the Americans were stronger even than he had imagined, and he immediately called for the 38th Division to begin moving up from the Shortlands. This was an experienced, battle-hardened division that had fought on Timor, Sumatra and Java, and at Hong Kong. Hyakutate now knew that he could not succeed by entrusting the goal to subordinate commanders with insufficient forces. The first naval battle of the Solomons came about because of the landing of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. The third such engagement, called the Battle of Cape Esperance, erupted because Admiral Gormley was sending reinforcements, Colonel Bryant Moore's 164th Infantry, north to Guadalcanal via Admiral Turner's transports, under the protection of a task force commanded by Rear Admiral Norman Scott. During the week that preceded this run, the Tokyo Express had been making frequent runs, and elements of the Sendai 2D Division were due to land on the night of October 11th. The troops, together with material and supplies, were carried in 6 destroyers. They were protected by 5 warships under the command of Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. Inevitably, the 2 enemy task forces met. Scott's first intimation of the enemy force came during the afternoon as his warships steamed north. Goto was coming down the slot. Scott increased speed to make contact southwest of Savo Island off Cape Esperance, signalling, "We will intercept. All ships prepare for action." Scott was hoping to redeem the disgrace of the Battle of Savo Island. His fleet consisted of 4 cruisers, Boise, Helena, Salt Lake City, and flagship San Francisco, plus 5 destroyers. Goto's fleet consisted of 3 cruisers, Kinugasa, Furutaka, and flagship Aoba, plus 2 destroyers. Goto, in addition to owning the smaller force, was taken by surprise, since Scott had managed to interpose himself between the troop-carrying reinforcement group, which was already into Iron Bottom Sound, and Goto's own heavy-firing squad. Shortly before midnight, Scott gave Helena and Boise permission to fire. The range between Helena and Ioba was then only 4,800 yards. Goto, in Ioba, assuming that the shells were coming from his own reinforcement group, failed to give the command to return fire. Instead, he ordered an evasive turn to the right, which laid the column open to broadside fire from Scott's warships. Goto's column took punishing blows in the opening minutes of the battle, the first fierce barrage hitting Oba, Furutaka, and destroyer Murakumo. Following the Japanese column's right turn, Ioba took a second salvo. One of the shells exploded near the flag bridge, fatally wounding Admiral Goto. At about the same time, Duncan took on the larger Furutaka and was badly wounded. Destroyer Fahrenholt also was badly hit, but unlike Duncan, did not sink. Japanese destroyer Fubuki took the massed fire of 3 American cruisers and sank almost instantaneously. 40 minutes past midnight, burning Furutaka slipped beneath the waves, but not before having participated in an attack, together with Aoba and undamaged Kinugasa, on American cruiser Boise, commanded by Captain Edward Moran. In the early rounds of the engagement, Boise had acquitted herself well and had come through without taking a hit. Then she took, in quick succession, an 8-inch shell on the starboard side, forward at the waterline, 2 5 inches starboard on the superstructure, and another pair of 5 inches in Moran's cabin. Gun 1 was put out of action, bulkheads cracked open like melons, paint burned and blistered, and noxious fumes from exploding shells billowed in the air to mingle with the heavy, sweetish odour of cordite. Captain Moran luckily was not in his cabin when the shells landed. A repair party sent up to deal with the resulting fires found a 5 by 3 foot hole in the centre of the room where the shells had burst. The captain's bunk was in flames. There was a twisted pile of metal on the deck that had once been his furniture. The deck and bulkhead were scored with the dents and gouges of hundreds of bits of shrapnel. A ship's clock, battered, lay face up on the deck, marking with its smashed mechanism the moment the shells had landed, 5 minutes before midnight. These were not the last hits on Boise that night, but the light cruiser survived the battle with damages. Destroyer Duncan did not. Around midnight she steamed drunkenly off to the north, her chart room a shambles, smoke everywhere, forecastle ablaze, deceased bodies sprawled throughout the blasted compartments and passageways. Survivors leaped overboard and clung to bits of debris to stay afloat in the oil-encrusted waters. The night of extreme fear was not yet ended for them. Only the timely arrival of destroyer McCalla saved many of the men in the water from a cruel end. Parties from the destroyer poured rifle fire at the sharks and scattered them. At daybreak, most of the survivors were hauled aboard. About 50 crewmen were lost that night, to shell or shark. The Battle of Cape Esperance was an American victory, but it had not prevented the Japanese reinforcement group from landing a good-sized increment of the Sendai 2D Division. What is more, it landed the heavy artillery that General Maruyama had been anticipating, and these guns began to speak. Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi, the 17th Army Artillery Commander, had the guns emplaced by the afternoon of October 13th and was bombarding Henderson Field with them. The American planes had to displace 2,000 yards eastward to the subsidiary strip known as Fighter 1. While the Battle of Cape Esperance was taking place, Turner was doggedly proceeding with his mission, and Scott's success in turning Goto back enabled Turner to steam into Iron Bottom Sound shortly after sunrise on the 13th to discharge the 164th Infantry, and an assortment of supplies ranging from anti-tank guns to candy bars. The major danger remained the large, powerful fleet of warships Admiral Yamamoto was sending down the slot. If he could not prevent the Americans from bringing reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal, then Yamamoto at least could destroy them after they arrived, and to this end he had the giant battleships Kongo and Haruna of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Second Fleet. The biggest danger to Yamamoto's warships came not from the American fleet, which still preferred not to challenge, but from the Cactus Air Force. Their power was once again illustrated, if it needed to be, the day after the Battle of Cape Esperance. American planes poured heavy fire on the withdrawing destroyer Murakumo, heavily damaging her. When destroyer Natsugumo came to her assistance, she herself came under heavy fire and sunk. The elimination of this air power was thus a prime objective of the long-range artillery which General Sumiyoshi had brought into the battle, and also of the Japanese air power, which was more flexible since the completion of the forward base at Kahili on the southern tip of Bougainville. These planes did their part on the 13th. 2 flights of enemy bombers caught our planes on the ground, set fire to one of our few remaining fuel dumps, and made a shambles of the landing strip. Major Frank Howe wrote. Clearly a crisis was near. It came that night. Shortly after midnight, Louis the Loose dropped his flares, alerting the Marines to the use of heavy arms that lay ahead. Vandergrift went to his dugout, which was a trench cut into the coral ridge. His chief of staff, Colonel Thomas, listened to the first of the shells coming in, and knew immediately that this was not going to be business as usual. "By God," he said, "those aren't 5 inches." Vandergrift nodded, feeling the frustration of knowing there was nothing he could do to stop what he called the monsters from coming in. Congo and Haruna had 500 rounds each of a new heavy-firing shell that had just arrived from Japan. Designated Type 0, they had a firecracker like shrapnel burst pattern, and they were indeed monsters. "The ensuing scene baffled description," wrote Admiral Tanaka, "the whole spectacle making the Ryogoku fireworks display seem like mere child's play. The night's pitch dark was transformed by fire into the brightness of day." Tanaka was referring to the planes, dumps, ammo lockers, buildings, everything, going up in flames or collapsing under the massive concussive effect of the 36 CMR's 14-inch shells. General Vandergrift has recorded the awful impact on a human being of such a massive strike on the nerves. One night quite early in the Guadalcanal campaign, a doctor and a chaplain, both fairly senior, were in my command post discussing combat fatigue. The doctor could not understand it. "Look at us," he said. "We are all much older and we are not touched by it." The chaplain averred that faith was the true defence. As was my wont when dealing with experts, I kept quiet. That night a shell from an enemy destroyer burst close to the doctor's dugout. He was not wounded physically, but his mental hurt caused the division surgeon to evacuate him. A week later a shell struck close to the chaplain's dugout again. He was not wounded, but had to be evacuated the next day. The shelling from Congo and Haruna, abetted by destroyers lobbing in 5 inches, lasted an hour and a half. When it ended, the Japanese fleet retired westward past Savo Island, leaving behind a shambles of wrecked material and broken bodies. There were more than 60 casualties, of whom 41, including 6 pilots, were dead. The airstrip was not usable. Great chunks had been ripped in the steel matting, large sections of which lay hundreds of yards distant. It did not matter anyway, since the Cactus Air Force had been virtually obliterated. There had been 39 operational dive bombers before the attack, and 40 Wildcats. Of the SBDs, all but 5 were destroyed. Of the Wildcats, 16 were ripped to bits. Most of the remainder were damaged. Only 2 planes took to the air the following morning, but they could not fight the Zeros. The Japanese, as a result of this single night's naval heavy fire, had complete and unquestioned air superiority over Guadalcanal. Reported Captain Hara, Japanese troops on the island were thrilled and encouraged by this spectacle, and urged the Navy to repeat the show. They did. The following night, cruisers Chokai and Kinugasa of Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet kept up the pressure with their 20 CR, 8-inch guns. At the same time, the remaining elements of the Sendai 2D Division arrived at Tassafaronga and began debarking. By dawn, Thursday, October 15th, more than 2,000 fresh troops had landed, and many of the supplies had been discharged at the beach and lugged to the safety of the coconut groves. Some Wildcats did get off the ground to attack this operation around noontime. They managed to set some gasoline aflame and blow up an ammunition dump. Later in the afternoon, Major Jack Cram, who flew General Roy S. Geiger's amphibian PBY nicknamed Blue Goose, decided to get into the act. He had a pair of torpedoes mounted so that they could be released by toggle switches. He took off for Tassafaronga, where he made an audacious attack on the beached transports in the face of heavy anti-aircraft fire. One of his torpedoes actually broke a transport in 2. Cram's plane was well holed by the time he returned to Henderson, and what was worse, he discovered that there was a 0 on his tail. Fortunately, a fighter pilot slipped in behind the Zero and flamed it with a burst of machine gun fire. For his silly and courageous act, Major Cram won himself a Navy Cross. Geiger's Wildcats gave Cram a hand, setting 2 more beached transports on fire, but in the dogfighting, 7 of the F-4Fs were downed. The Japanese fleet maintained its unrelenting pressure. After dusk, cruisers Maya and Myoku invaded the airfield. More troops were landed. It was during this period that the Japanese, for the first time, acquired parity insofar as number of troops on the island was concerned. Each side had approximately 22,000 men. Japanese shells and heavy fires were not the only cause of disability among the Marines. Malaria was taking a heavy toll, despite the atabrine pills which were supposed to prevent the disease. Partly the drug proved ineffective, and partly the men refused to take the pills which, said Vandergrift, tinged the skin yellow, nauseated the stomach, and caused the ears to ring. Many hundreds of Marines came down with malaria and fought with 103-degree fevers. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz admitted glumly, "It now appears we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus our supply of the positions will only be done at great expense to us. The situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical." There was only one bright spot in this deteriorating situation. On October 18th, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey arrived in Noumea, where he received a sealed envelope marked secret. Opening it, Halsey read, "You will take command of the South Pacific area and South Pacific forces immediately." Halsey was flabbergasted. He said later he had felt astonishment, apprehension, and regret. Vandergrift had no such reaction. He was delighted. Halsey would supply just the aggressive leadership Vandergrift felt was urgently needed in the critical days. The Marines were all for the change. Halsey was one of the inspirational leaders of World War II, one who, said Nimitz with admiration, quickly infused his subordinates with his own confidence and aggressiveness. On the island itself, when the news was passed about, one correspondent reported, "I will never forget it. 1 minute we were too limp with malaria to crawl out of our foxholes. The next we were running around shouting like kids. Attack, repeat, attack." The plan of attack called for 3 simultaneous probes, and the jump-off date was October 22nd. Lieutenant General Hyakutate's scheme resembled in many particulars the earlier one of Major General Kawaguchi, except that the strength of the attackers was vastly greater, and the penetrations were to take place at widely scattered points along the perimeter. Lieutenant General Maruyama was entrusted with the main force, which was composed of 2 wings, each of which had the strength of 3 reinforced infantry battalions. Kawaguchi commanded the right wing, Major General Yumio Nasu, the left wing. The remainder of the Sendai 2D Division, the 16th Infantry Regiment, was held in reserve to beef up whichever wing seemed to be making a successful penetration. The division marched from Kokumbona along a narrow trail that passed through the jungle south of Grassy Knoll, Mount Austin, to assembly areas deep in the rear of the Marine lines. This was a difficult march. Each man was burdened down by 60 pounds of weight. His weapon, ammunition, hand grenades, pack, 12 days' rations, and at least 1 mortar or artillery shell. General Maruyama, whose sense of history was no less well developed than that of his predecessors, had the path named Maruyama Road. While Maruyama's troops, in strength about 7,000, snaked east along the Maruyama Road, experiencing the dubious pleasures of the rank odours, stifling heat, chilling night rains, and hostile ecology of the jungle, the other 2 prongs of Hyakutate's attack also moved forward. One, under the orders of the division artillery commander, Major General Sumiyoshi, was to attack across the sand spit at the mouth of the Matanikau, while Sumiyoshi's big howitzers pounded the airfield. The other, under the command of Colonel Oka, was to cross the Matanikau about a mile or so upstream, turn north, and come in at the rear of the Marine lines along the Matanikau, cutting these men off. Bombers from Rabaul and Zeros from Kehili would provide air support. Warships of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet would come in to give Henderson more of the heavy shelling they had been serving up, and just for good measure, a reinforced battalion called the Coley Detachment was held in readiness to land at Coley Point and strike the Marines from the east. The plan was certainly comprehensive, and there did not seem to be any reason why it would not work, even after General Maruyama discovered that the jungle was making forward progress very tedious. The heavy weapons were lagging behind. A number of artillery pieces had fallen by the wayside. Nevertheless, the attack would proceed as planned, except that, because of the delays, there would be a postponement to 5 p.m., October 23rd. Vandergrift did not expect another enemy attack from the south. He felt that major thrusts in the future would have to come from the Matanikau. Sumiyoshi's recurrent artillery, plus his tank probes on October 20th and 21, helped to confirm this opinion. There was daily contact along the Matanikau as patrols from both sides engaged in firefights. Vandergrift's expectations, plus the arrival of the Army's 164th Infantry, had caused the general to reorganize his defenses. Along the Sound, on both sides of the Lunga River, he had the 3D Defense Battalion. To their right, Colonel Bryant Moore's 164th Infantry went along the Sound to the Tenaru River, then south along the river to curve west and tie in with the southern line along Vicious Ridge, which was lightly held by Puller's battalion of the 7th Marines. The line to the southwest was held by the L'Est Marines, and to the west, going north back up to the Sound, by Edson's 5th Marines. Still farther west were the forward outposts along the Matanikau, held by the 3D Battalion of the East Marines and the 3D Battalion of the 7th Marines. Colonel Del Valle's artillery was positioned so that it could support any of these sectors. Vandergrift was fairly well content with this disposition, which included an infantry battalion and most of a tank battalion in division reserve. But he did notice a weakness. The battalions along the Matanikau had an exposed left flank which the Japanese could exploit. So, as his last act before flying to Noumea for a conference with Admiral Halsey, he ordered Colonel Herman Hanneken's battalion to displace from their positions south of Henderson Field and march to fill this gap. Hanneken was to defend a series of east-west ridges. Hanneken's men marched to the ridges, and because of jungle, uneven terrain, and frequent barrages of mortar and artillery from Sumiyoshi across the Matanikau, it took them from dawn on October 24th until dusk to get there and dig in. The ridges were grass on top, but coral underneath and hard as cement. Hanneken put 3 infantry companies on line, and between 2 of them, on a protruding knoll, put a machine gun platoon led by Sergeant Mitchell Page, who was to win a Medal of Honor in the battle. Vandergrift, in the meantime, had gone off to Noumea to give Admiral Halsey an eyewitness picture of the situation on Guadalcanal. Halsey asked him if he would have to evacuate. Vandergrift said, "I can hold, but I've got to have more active support than I have been getting." After mulling things over, Halsey turned to the Marine General and told him, "You go on back there, Vandergrift. I promise to get you everything I have." Vandergrift was heartened by this show of support. He returned to Guadalcanal considerably cheered, only to find that a massive thrust against his positions had commenced in his absence. Luck was not with General Maruyama. On the 23rd, the left wing of his attack notified him that it was ready to push off, but General Kawaguchi's wing was not. They had not yet reached their assembly areas. Maruyama, rather incensed, relieved Kawaguchi on the spot. Nevertheless, Maruyama had no choice but to postpone the attack one day, information which did not reach Sumiyoshi in time to prevent him from mounting his supporting attack as planned. Sumiyoshi himself lay in a malarial coma, unable to perform. His officers followed the plan to the letter, however, jumping off with a dozen tanks at the sandspit. The Marines held their fire nervously as the monsters clanked toward them. Then, on command, they let loose. Only one reached the east bank, as Vandergrift later learned, and it evidently stopped for orientation over the foxhole of one of the men, who reached up, put a hand grenade in the tread, pulled the ring, ducked, and blew off the tread. The tank veered drunkenly, then took 3 hits from a 75 mm gunned half-track and suffered heavy explosions in the crew compartments. As for Sumiyoshi's infantry, Del Valle's artillery, pre-registered, blew more than 600 of them to bits as they waited in assembly areas. With sunset on October 23rd, the Marines found themselves almost exhausted of artillery shells and aviation gas, which were now critically important. A message went forward to Noumea, pleading for the necessary material, and a hastily organized supply line of Douglas transports brought 2 days' worth in. The following day, the 24th, Maruyama was satisfied that he could commence the attack. At noon, he issued division orders. The division has succeeded in reaching the rear flank of the enemy in absolute secrecy. In accordance with plans of my own, I intend to exterminate the enemy around the airfield in one blow. However, the Marines had plans not to be exterminated which conflicted with Maruyama's, and more significantly, the general's luck had not yet turned. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a torrential gusher turned the jungle to swamp and destroyed all communication between Maruyama's units, just as they were stealthily moving up to the lines of departure. In the confusion, the right wing once again fell behind. When the rain finally ceased, the left wing attacked unsupported, almost 7 hours late. Shortly before midnight, a flare burst in the night sky. The Ist Battalion of the 29th Infantry under Colonel Shojiro Ishimiya overran an outpost and burst through the wire in front of Puller's battalion in 2 places. Puller's defences stiffened, containing the breakthrough, and mortar and artillery poured down on the attackers. All up and down the line, repeated thrusts failed to push through. But Puller was taking heavy casualties, and in the dark, the Army's reserve, Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Hall's 3D Battalion of the 164th, was ordered to come over and help. They crossed the unfamiliar terrain in small groups with the help of Marine guides, and came up on line to plug the holes that Ishimiya's battalion, almost single-handedly, was ripping in the southern perimeter. Early the following morning, October 25th, units of the Division Reserve moved up to backstop Puller and Hall. Despite Ishimiya's personal bravery, with the regimental colours under his tunic, he and a small force maintained an enclave deep in Puller's lines. The Japanese 29th Infantry had taken a terrible beating. More than 1,000 corpses glutted the battlefield, many of them on the lips of, or actually within, Marine foxholes. There had been vicious infighting. October 25th was subsequently to be known as Dugout Sunday, for as the Japanese destroyers cannonaded and the sky reverberated with the sounds of air battle, the Marines spent as much time as possible burrowing for safety in their dugouts. Marine 5-inch shore batteries turned the destroyers back, preventing the landing of the Koli detachment, but Sumiyoshi's 6-inch land batteries kept up the pounding of Henderson. That night, after sunset, Maruyama tried Puller and Hall again, and once again was repelled. The 16th Infantry went the way of the 29th. It was more disaster for the Sendai 2D Division, with half the officers deceased or seriously wounded. Among the dead was Major General Nasu. The reserves had all been committed, the division's rations totally exhausted. Conceded Maruyama, no hope was left. To the west, however, Colonel Akinosuke Oka mounted his attack as planned, with his composite battalion. All survivors of previous battles, these were remnants of the Ichiki detachment and the Kawaguchi brigade. They struck hard at the knoll on which Sergeant Mitchell Page had emplaced his machine guns. To the front, the ridge sloped gently down toward a draw overgrown with kunai grass tall enough to conceal a man. Beyond that was the jungle. To the left was a heavily overgrown gully some feet deep. Oka's men hit simultaneously at both these points and overran the forward machine guns. In the dark, struggling men fell upon each other with bayonets and bare hands, swords and violent curses. Sergeant Page ran from gun to keep them firing, and with the help of a few survivors of his squad, prevented Oka from exploiting his penetration. The battalion exec, Major Odell Connolly, then put together a team of bandsmen, wiremen, runners and cooks, and even mess boys who had brought hot food up to the front lines and stayed behind, just in case, and mounted a counterattack that recaptured the lost spur and drove Oka back into the jungle. At dawn, Sergeant Page picked up a heavy machine gun, cradled it in his hands, and started down the forward slope of the ridge into the kunai grass. As he knew some Japanese, he called out, "Tate! Tate! Isogu! Stand up! Hurry!" A group of about 30 enemy soldiers popped into view. Page fired at them, and they peeled off like grass under a mowing machine. The battle for Henderson Field was over. The jungle was once again so still that if it weren't for the evidence of the hideous night of combat, the bodies littering the hillside, it all might have been nothing more than a bad dream, but the reality was inescapable. Japanese losses ran to about 2,000. The Ist Division suffered 86 deceased, 119 wounded. At the knoll Sergeant Page defended, it became necessary to dynamite blast a portion of the spur to cover them, thus eliminating a good part of the real estate for which the battle had been fought. The Sendai 2D Division retreated in disarray, the right wing east to Coley Point, the left wing west via the Maruyama Road. "Death is lighter than a feather," reads the motto of the division. "Duty is heavier than a mountain." Support for Vandergrift's valiant defense of Henderson Field came during this fateful weekend from a very high source. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had doubted the island could be held, came around now to believing that not only could it be held, it had to be held. On October 24th, he sent a memorandum to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "My anxiety about the Southwest Pacific is to make sure that every possible weapon gets into that area to hold Guadalcanal, and that having held it in this crisis, that munitions and planes and crews are on the way to take advantage of our success." Bill Halsey had already acted in accordance with this aggressive posture. On October 25th, Admiral Yamamoto was steaming south with combined fleet massed for battle. He had Nagumo's Third Fleet, including carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, and Kondo's Second Fleet, which featured the battleships Kongo and Haruna. Altogether 4 carriers, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 24 destroyers. Yamamoto felt supremely confident. To stop this behemoth of naval power, Halsey interposed a 2-carrier task force under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, who had only 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and 14 destroyers to put on the table. Halsey had his first crucial command decision to make, and he made it with a brevity and force that was as typical as it was inspirational. The message to Kinkaid, heard as well on Guadalcanal, said simply, "Attack, repeat, attack." The ensuing engagement, fought October 26th, 27 to the east of Guadalcanal, became known as the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. It was somewhat inconclusive. In the engagement itself, Nagumo was the victor by virtue of sinking carrier Hornet and damaging carrier Enterprise, battleship South Dakota, cruiser San Juan, and 3 destroyers, one of which was subsequently sunk by American guns. Japanese casualties, by contrast, included carriers Zuiho and Shokaku and cruiser Chikuma, all badly damaged, but there were no sinkings. Combined fleet retired to Truk with a tactical edge in the battle, but almost 100 planes and their pilots went down to Wildcat and battleship anti-aircraft fire. The Americans lost 76 planes, but the American fleet had not, as Yamamoto had hoped, been decisively defeated. Despite all the carnage that had already taken place, the central issue, control of Guadalcanal, was still very much in doubt. Soon, very soon, there would come a fork in the road, and the fate of Japan or America would be sealed. But that definitive battle